You're rolling.
So it's just wonderful to be joining you all this evening. I see lots of friends and colleagues who are on the screen in your little boxes. So some of you with fake backgrounds, I know your backgrounds, can't fool me. But enjoying those as we live still in this virtual world. But I'm very grateful to the CPCRN for hosting this evening and giving me and also Judy an opportunity to have this dialogue. It really is my treat to be able to launch a conversation with Judy about her book, which I hope you'll all have a chance to get your hands on and read through. If nothing, because it's important for your roots. If you're interested in survivorship at all, you need to know the backstory. And I think, as you just heard Cindy say, it's surprising where we've come from. And I hope at the end of our conversation this evening, we'll talk about where do we need to go to. So Judy, I have to start for this by really going back and asking you, when was it that you realized that you were going to, or perhaps more correctly, you needed to write this book?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. This is great fun. I love these events, and you know, if you look for silver linings for the horrific year that we've just been through, Zoom is one of them, because as an author, not having to jet from place to place has been great, because I can sit in my yoga pants and do this. And also, I've been able to connect with far more people, including survivors in the UK with Hodgkin's International Organization. So it's really been great fun. So thanks again for having me. So I am a biographer by profession. I love telling a great story. And I had written 2 books about ordinary people who'd been extraordinarily courageous during World War II, one a man and one a woman, and was looking for the next great story to tell when I too was diagnosed with cancer. It was 10 years ago, actually, this year. And after cancer, I was shocked. I had very carefully researched my diagnosis, or my specific type of breast cancer and my treatment, but I had never even thought about researching survivorship. I just thought when it was all over, the old Judy would jump out of the chemo cake. And although I didn't suffer from any of the psychosocial issues that many survivors have, I had an awful lot of physical ones that I was not expecting at all. So survivorship kind of became my next focus to at least research, just for self-preservation. And I thought about writing a book about survivorship. There are lots of those, not about my own story, but just about survivorship in general. But I'm a storyteller. So instead, I started an organization. And through my organization here in Phoenix, I was introduced to Tucson resident and a former oncology nurse, Susie Lay. And once I met her, she promised in an email to talk my ear off, and she did. But I paid her back with questions in the thousands over the next couple of years. And when I left that lunch, I ran out to my car and literally called my agent and said, I found the story. This has to be told. I don't think he's ever wrapped his mind around why it was important to tell, but hopefully some of the 17 million American survivors will, as well as the healthcare providers, the researchers, the co-survivors. It's our shared history. And it was wonderful to write. My address book grew tenfold with new friends, including you.
And my treat, Judy, to have that friendship. And of course, for those of you who don't know, Susie Lay was one of those intrepid 23 people who later went on to create what we know as the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship. And I'll come back to that in a second, because this book really is about the history of that. I know, Judy, that what you really wanted was to write about a book about Susie Lay, but Susie would never have let anybody do that, because she is, if nothing, a beacon of modesty in the work she's done, but a powerhouse one could see why you were compelled to think about that, because she has been a powerhouse behind the movement, unstoppable, out there on the road, really communicating about this and living the experience and sharing that lived experience. So I know we'll come back to her name often over the course of this hour. Thinking back to your own experience, Judy, so I'm going to ask you a question. Did the term survivor come up when you were diagnosed?
It did, although my first oncologist, when I asked her about these physical issues I was dealing with and why I hadn't received any material about it or anything, I truly asked in a kind way. She became very defensive and said, well, it wasn't important to discuss it with you. We were busy saving your life. And so that I thought was an odd answer, but it was what really got my whole research ball rolling. And the term survivor actually did bother me because I didn't feel that it was powerful enough. And, I always use the story that if somebody had told congratulated Vince Lombardi for surviving the Chicago Bears, he would have punched him. We didn't survive, we won. So that was I kind of thought, okay, I'm going to go off the reservation. I'm going to be a cancer winner. Well, that was stupid. It didn't last very long. And now, of course, I understand 100-fold where the term came from, why it was an important definition to create. And so while there are many messages in this book, I think that's a really important one, because I think it's important to feel whether you have no evidence of disease, whether you have metastatic disease, whether you live with cancer until the end of your life, all three of those groups are survivors. And I think that's just a really important mindset.
So, one of the debates a lot of us have, and the survivorship community has, is the debate between a survivor and then survivorship. Is there a difference there?
In my mind, do you mean?
Sure. Or now that you've written this book and you've heard lots of people talk about it, what's your sort of synthesis out of that, or what do you take out of that?
Well, I guess I think it's kind of interesting. I think survivorship, for some who will always have cancer, I think that's maybe an easier pill to swallow, if you'll pardon the pun, rather than just coming out and identifying themselves as a survivor. But I think, so the whole idea came from there were two people who were really ones who organized the first weekend meeting of the 23 that became the NCCS. So Dr. Fitzhugh Mullen, who I had the great opportunity of speaking with a number of times and speaking in person with him. And he said he was on a speaking tour after his own book, Vital Signs, came out about his cancer diagnosis and journey. And he was in the vestibule outside the conference room where he had just spoken, and this woman came out really furtively, and she had a bandana on her head and no eyebrows, so like big beacon, she's going through cancer treatment. And she kind of looked around and she said to him, I just want you to know, I hope I get to be where you are. I'm not supposed to be here because I'm not really a survivor yet. And he said that just broke his heart, that people get this god-awful diagnosis. They go through, whatever the treatment is, it's tough. And then at the end, they still have to wait to graduate into the next phase. And it was always a moving goal line. I had triple negative breast cancer. So for me, for those who are still counting survivorship as beginning at a certain phase, triple negatives, we can say we're survivors at 3 years out. Most everybody else is 5 years out. There was one time when it was 10 years out. And so one of the newspaper articles that I had found that helped inform this, I did a lot of research in newspaper archives, was that it made the point that, so if you make it to 5 years and you have a new diagnosis at 5 years and 1 day, do they strip your title away? Are you not a survivor anymore? And so I think it is still a very difficult title to wrap your mind around.
The short answer to your question is, yeah, you're still a survivor, because you're a survivor no matter what happens until you make your exit. Whether you want to label yourself as one or not, that's the debate. And you, I think, nailed it very beautifully and articulately, as you do, Judy, when you write. And that is, it's for some people, it's thrivership. It's not just surviving. I didn't merely survive this. I'm taking this and running with it and doing amazing things with it, as so many do and did. And certainly this book is about a lot of those people who took their experience and metamorphosed it into something phenomenal. One thing that's so clear in this book is you talk to all of these individuals. So Fitz and Susie Lay and Patty Gans and Barbara Hoffman and the founders, the people who are really the movers and shakers behind the movement. What was that like?
Well, for someone whose first two books were about deceased individuals, it was refreshing because I didn't have to guess at what they thought or what they felt. In Susie's case, when they met in October of 1986 in Albuquerque, of all places, because the other organizer, Catherine Logan, lived in Albuquerque, so she got all these amazing people to come to Albuquerque. And Susie said she walked into the dinner the first night and couldn't believe there were other people in the world who were willing to have open conversations about their cancer diagnoses. Because even though by that time most of the contagion fear had faded, humans had learned that infectious diseases are what kill people. Therefore, diseases that kill people must be contagious. They must be, contagious diseases kill people. Therefore, cancer must be a contagious disease because it kills people. And so Susie, having been diagnosed in 1972, just was still keeping it inside and not saying anything. And, Fitz was just so enthusiastic about the founding and them all getting together, and most specifically, of course, the work they did after. Barbara, like Susie, is extremely shy is not the right word, but just not one to talk about what she did in the way of discrimination against cancer survivors, and seeing to it, testifying before Congress, seeing to it that survivors could no longer be fired, lose their insurance, not join the military. I mean, it's silly to us now, but that was the real thing. And so to talk to people who were at ground zero, it was like interviewing General Patton.
Yeah, no, and to me, it's so important to have this documentation of that dialogue and what happened and the sequencing of all of that, how these events rolled out and how one thing built on another. Back in the early 70s, again, when Susie was diagnosed, when Ellen Stovall was diagnosed, that you didn't talk about cancer. It was absolutely taboo. In fact, you didn't tell the patient. And there were studies back then that said 90% of physicians wouldn't tell their patient they had cancer in the 70s.
Right.
The irony is,
part of that, I think, was because it just was devastating news. They, more than 50% died. So they really didn't have, it was just bad news. And so there weren't the additional disciplines like psycho-oncology and oncology social workers and oncology nurses who could address so many of the issues that the patients had at this horrific diagnosis.
so true. And I'm sure all of us in this space could also say we've done a pretty good job of changing that landscape. We are not there yet. Certainly we hear even today, people say, well, nobody ever referred me to a social worker. Nobody ever asked me, how are things at home? Nobody told me what these late effects were going to be. And that was certainly what this group was interested in, is what happens now after the sort of aggressive treatment ends or the curative attempt is over. What happens now? And their recognition of that was fairly potent into bringing them together. I love the idea that Fitz used to talk about. We had to have an alumni club of patients who've had cancer. And when they put out the almanac, that sort of charting the journey almanac, it was going to be the Whole Earth catalog. I very date myself on that. Whole Earth catalog for cancer survivors, because you needed a roadmap out there. How are you going to function without some kind of roadmap? In your prologue, Judy, you talk about the demons of survivorship, and then you refer to them throughout the book. What do you mean by that, and what are the demons?
Well, as I said, I used a lot of source material of the different periods in which I wrote. And so some of them were fairly obvious. The discrimination, certainly, communication with the medical community, not anyone's fault. It just, as I said, the doctors didn't have good news. And oncology really didn't take shape and become well known until in the 70s. So the earlier decades, they were called chemotherapists. There were a variety of different names for them. Self-image is another demon. Those of us who've had surgery are reminded every time we undress that we had surgery and it was for cancer. But that also, for some people, really causes a feeling of a loss of femininity or masculinity. And I don't mean to be gender insensitive, but I think for women that's particularly true. And then intimacy, relationships, and fertility, that kind of is another demon. Fertility in particular, at the time that I was doing research, which was for this particular part of the book, so this was like 2018, I believe, 50%, that's 50% of women and men of child creating age are not being told that their treatment could impact their fertility. And that's in like 2018, as I said, that's crazy. And then there are the government and corporate cover-ups. We all remember the breast implant questioning, and it doesn't really matter whether silicone implants cause diseases or not. The very fact that scientists and Dow Corning individuals didn't man up and say, we don't know, we're working on it. Instead, they tried absolutely ridiculous things to cover all of that up. And then another really important example was the downwinder group, which were the people who were exposed to radiation because of the above ground nuclear testing being done at the Nevada test lab. And at first we thought, test site, and at first we thought it was just the surrounding states, including mine here in Arizona. But the fact of the matter is that because of prevailing winds, the days that these shots went up, all 100 and some of them, that material was floated across the country all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Everyone alive at the time was exposed, and the government, it took them quite a while to own up to that. And then, to make matters worse, those who are eligible for compensation only have until next year, and nobody's saying that either. So those who are still hoping to get some kind of compensation need to file. The psychological soup, so PTSD, fear of recurrence, again, that's another whole big basket. And then later added, I started out with those 6, but then as I went along, particularly as the NCCS grew and as their work grew, it was very clear that there was social apathy. Survivorship isn't sexy. Ellen said that. We can get on board with pictures of women in kerchiefs holding babies, and the implication is, oh, will she live to raise her child? But no one ever thinks about that woman after treatment. Will she be able to walk into the church when the child gets married because she has such severe neuropathy? And then, of course, the last one is long-term challenges, and Susie has spoken eloquently about those. She calls the long-term survivors the canaries in the coal mine, because they're the ones that can inform the medical community. This was too much of that, or not enough of this. And golly, those people have been to the war and back.
Totally agree. And of course, one of the reasons that Susie is so articulate about this, aside from her passion, is again going back to her lived experience, having had, the state of the art treatment for her Hodgkin's disease delivered while she was a young woman. She has paid across her lifetime the consequences of that cure. As one of the former, writers of the leads on the network, or which was the House newspaper for NCCS for many years, Natalie Davis Spingarn, wrote about cancer treatment as being the gift that keeps on giving.
That's right.
Certainly, Susie has been a legacy of that. Ellen, a legacy of that. Fitz, a legacy of that. All of these individuals actually, in the case of Susie and Ellen, not Susie is still going strong despite the fact that her treatments want to keep taking her down. But you think of Ellen, you think of Fitz, who have succumbed to their secondary effects, that the cure caused them, yes, to still be here for a long period of time than they might otherwise, but to have that compromise in their life that we still definitely struggle with. Talk a little bit about that founding event, because this is that biography really of NCCS, Judy, about, what went on there and why was that so revolutionary?
Well, and the fun thing about writing this, as I said, I'm a biographer by profession, so I love telling stories. But as a group biography, I was able to focus on a small number of them, even though, as we know, it takes a village. And it's a great tool for a writer, because sometimes people's stories from cradle to grave aren't always interesting every single moment. So it was wonderful to be able to move from that founding group forward throughout the decades. So they met, as I said, in Albuquerque, at Albuquerque's first all-suite hotel. It was October of 1986. They were not able to schedule it near the time of their famous hot air balloon festival, because they had a Jewish member coming, and the hot air balloon festival was the same weekend as part of Rosh Hashanah. But anyway, so they met in this all-suite hotel. They went to a dinner that first night in a place called the Cooperage, because it was round and looked like a barrel, and a cooper makes a wine barrel. So that was their first meeting. And then the next morning, they sat down with giant paper glued to the wall and just started figuring out what they wanted to do. Catherine, who lived in Albuquerque, had sent out something like 85 letters to people asking if they'd be interested in being involved in some kind of a cancer network. What did they think they wanted that network to be or look like? And when all was said and done, 23 of them made that journey. But the interesting thing was that not to go all woo-woo on you, but it was as if they were supposed to all be there at that moment. They all had fabulous backgrounds, as I mentioned, their different professions, and they also all had different skills in terms of writing and speaking and researching and organizing. This was pre-internet, pre-cell phone days, so even pre-fax days. So everything had to be typed out and sent via U.S. mail, and long distance rates prevailed. So the fact that they were able to do this, I think, is just miraculous. And they figured out their mission. They figured out the definition of survivorship, which, as I'm sure all of you know, begins at the moment of diagnosis through the rest of life. They wrote the rest of their charter. And at the end of the weekend, they passed the hat and collected some money to get themselves rolling. And they called that their first assembly, but it was also later cleverly coined the Constitutional Convention for Cancer Survivorship, which I think it absolutely was. I mean, it was certainly the universe bringing together the right people at the right time.
You know, it's such a great story. I see the drive to write this up and say, oh my gosh, we've got to get this on paper and tell this story, because it is such a compelling story. And it is such a reminder of what a small group of people can do. I mean, sort of old Margaret Mead quote, you know, the power of a small group of people to change the world. And I think all of us are in this group are beneficiaries of that. We've all been able to do the work that we do, provide the care that we do, really standing on the shoulders of the founders of the coalition and forging ahead with that definition. I will say, and there is a question in the chat from Cristina Garcia Vivar, who's an associate professor of Public University of Navarre in Spain. So thank you for joining us. Woohoo. Talking about the experience of cancer in families. And actually, when they had the definition of who's a survivor, they, right from the get-go, it wasn't actually appended later. Some people say it was, but it was not. They included family in that as secondary survivors, and acknowledged the fact that family are affected by this too, and can also call themselves survivors if they choose to. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of that. They don't realize that that was a very broad umbrella that they created under which we could look at the world differently. Jamie Stutz also asked a question about whether we think that people who have a cancer that's been widely studied, well addressed, like breast cancer, may have a different perspective on survivorship than, say, someone diagnosed with lung cancer or pancreatic cancer, where the situation is more dire because we don't diagnose these in an early stage necessarily. Jamie, did I get that right? Otherwise, chime in.
Yeah, as a lung cancer person, you can probably guess my foundations of my hypothesis and my experience in working with lung cancer survivors is they really feel like an outsider in the survivorship world from their perspective, and I can understand that as to why they feel like they haven't been embraced by the larger survivorship community, and that some of that, you know, could be self-inflicted in terms of not, you know, engaging the survivor community as much. But I just think it's worth talking about how certain segments may or may not be experiencing some of the broader benefits of having challenged and tackled some of the early challenges that we kind of have been asked and answered and addressed in other areas.
I think I will tell you that I hide every October. I just, you know, I don't wish cancer on anybody. I don't wish it on myself. I don't want it again. But it gets old, even for breast cancer survivors. So I always say I had triple negative because that makes me different. It's different cancer, breast cancer. But I understand, Jamie, exactly what you're saying, and I think that must be true for those, as I mentioned earlier, for those who have either a cancer that is frequently diagnosed at a later stage, more progressed, or for those who have metastatic disease, in trying to wrap their minds around that. And so while this is a biography of the cancer survivorship movement, I have always tried to stress that this work, even though we talk about survivorship, this work and these individuals, including Dr. Julia, have made such an enormous difference for all of us, regardless of cancer type, regardless of stage, regardless of whether you're NED or not. That's why this is an important history to know. It no matter how dire or unpleasant your position may be, you still in 2021 have great benefits that were not available 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
It's also a great reflection and where history does make a difference. I see that we have Melissa Hudson on the call, who's a world-class pediatric oncologist and has really been a mover and shaker in childhood cancer survivorship. But the original organization that represented children was called Candlelighters. It was the parents of children because the children did not survive. I mean, that has since disappeared, and we have very robust childhood cancer group, Children's Cause. But it was, to your point, Jamie, when you're not the survivor, it's your family members who's going to create the foundation for you. PanCan, similarly, was created by loved ones of individuals with these diseases, was not originally driven as much by survivors themselves. But that history is shifting, particularly now as we find earlier stage lung cancer. That's going to open up a whole new array of thinking about what is survivorship all about. And even the Office of Cancer Survivorship has gently revised their definition to be sure that people understand that survivors encompass the whole spectrum. It's anyone, anytime for the duration. You don't stop being a survivor because you're back in treatment or you have a secondary effect of some kind. Nobody takes that away from you. One question I have too, Judy, is, you were so close to this. What's your sense about how this grew? How did NCCS grow over time?
Again, I am just always amazed at how perfect the timing was and how thirsty or hungry the survivors were for somebody or something that could help them. Because as you talked about Candlelighters, that was actually one of the very first, if not the first, cancer support organization. And its benefits were obvious. So when NCCS met that first weekend in October, as I said, that was their first assembly. So then they started having other assemblies each year on their anniversary or thereabouts. The first several were in Albuquerque, and then they started spreading out in other parts of the country. And those who could, because of course you had to get there and pay for your hotel and food and that kind of thing, but those who could get there just came in droves. And they were so desperate for that kind of, not just learning about their disease or learning about how to prevent more disease or how to handle their survivorship challenges. They were just desperate to connect with other survivors. And when the NCCS group wrote the almanac, the Cancer Survivors Almanac, it was the first thing of its kind. Nothing had ever come out like that. And chapters, in fact, I think Patty Gans said, I can't remember, one of them said that most Americans do more research before they buy a refrigerator than they do when they get a cancer diagnosis and now have to go to treatment. And so when that came out in the late 80s, that too was just absolutely revolutionary. It was a resource that could touch anybody those who were not able to get to the assemblies, those who didn't even know about NCCS yet. And so they just started gaining momentum. And as they did, they were very good, even before Ellen Stovall, because she had connections in the media. But even before that, there's a significant amount of articles that are available in old newspapers about NCCS and the survivorship movement.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that at the end, because I have a fundamental question about where does NCCS go from here? I mean, it went from a very small organization that was very grassroots. That was Catherine Logan Correa's vision of what it should be. And then it moved to Washington, so it had an advocacy voice. And, when we were all members, and I've been a member forever, except I wasn't there at the founding, but I joined in 1987. I was on the board for it. So full disclosure, I was on the board for a while. I helped to chair some of the assemblies. I helped with their white papers, et cetera. in essence, helped create the office I was later supposed to serve in, and then Ellen turned around and lobbied me and said, well, we wrote this paper, now you got to take the job. So nobody ever said no to Ellen, ever. Nobody ever said no to Ellen. But it's, what do we do with this kind of an organization now? What is the role for this kind of a movement now?
Well, I think that I always, and this came to me as I was writing this. So you were right. They started as a very grassroots organization. They officed in the kitchen of an old house that was the headquarters of Catherine's other organization, support group that she created called Living Through Cancer. And so they officed out of there. Then, as you said, they grew and went to Washington, D.C., did fabulous things, created the Office of Cancer Survivorship, had the march, which brought 200,000 individuals to the mall in Washington. And I just, on Friday afternoon, I was in Washington last week, and I got some lunch from a food truck and sat on the mall halfway between the Capitol and the Washington Monument. And every time I go to Washington, I do this, and I look at this space and think, wow, this was packed with 200,000 people. Because Ellen said to Betsy Clark, well, Louis Farrakhan just had his million-man march. How hard can it be? Let's have a march. And they did. And I always tell people to envision that iconic scene from Forrest Gump where he's on stage speaking about Vietnam in front of the reflecting pool. Now, they were actually, if they turned the stage around, it would have been where the march actually was. But if you think of that number of people in that space, I mean, it was nuts. So they did all these wonderful things. And because they did all these wonderful things, several more things came from it. First of all, they went from grassroots to a national advocacy forum, which in turn allowed more grassroots organizations to grow, my little one included. There's a great deal to be said about large national organizations, but running a smaller organization is way easier to begin with. And it's wonderful having all this one-on-one interaction with the group of survivors here in Phoenix. So because NCCS went to Washington, the rest of us, it's kind of the completion of the circle, the rest of us got to form our little grassroots organization. And they realized wisely that some of the biggest changes that they could make in cancer healthcare and in survivorship growth, because it needed to be seen as a part of the cancer continuum. It's not just prevention and cure, whatever that means, and treatment. It's also survivorship. That's a part of the cancer continuum. And in order to really make those statements loudly so that they would be heard by all, they needed to be in Washington to do that. They needed to be positioned between the steps of Congress, where research funding is decided, and an NCI where research is being done. So there was really no other choice. And that was hard for Catherine because she didn't want to leave Albuquerque, so she didn't. But the organization never would have been if it hadn't been for her.
Yeah, no, it was her brainstorm. It was absolutely her vision that got this launched. And then it had a life of its own in many ways. I mean, really took off from there. Yeah, just sort of the graphic for those of you who weren't at the march. I mean, you have to, again, picture being down on the mall with all of these 200,000 people, and the big, jumbotrons are up there. And Betsy Clark said, what's a jumbotron, when she was organizing? I've never even heard of what one of those were, or what it was going to take to organize this. That chapter in particular was great to read again, and to say, oh my gosh, they had a cast of incredible people and fundraising, Mike Milken throwing money at them. It was like amazing. But here's General Schwarzkopf on the big screen talking about survivorship. It was like awesome. Anyway, I think that's how movements are born, and you get those inspiring voices and you bring the people under the tent. And so speaking of bringing people under the tent, Judy, what was your sense again in doing all the research on this? How good a job have we done to really make this a movement that reaches everybody, including our communities of color, our underserved communities, our geographically isolated communities? What's your sense about that, having talked to a lot of the people in the movement?
When I spoke with Dr. Lovell Jones, he had a beautiful story that explained how NCCS might grow in those communities, and it's true in terms of the survivorship movement, really anything else. He talked about the grace note, which in music is a note that's played, and I'm not a musician, I played the guitar in college, but that was just to get boys. It's a note that is played that you don't really hear specifically, but without it, the music is flat. And so what he was saying was NCCS needed a grace note. They needed people to join who didn't necessarily need to be front and center, but people like to and can better associate with others that look like them or act like them. And it doesn't help, he said, to create separate organizations, because that just further divides. He said it just needs to be, and of course NCCS was more than willing to be all-encompassing to groups. They just weren't sure how to do it at that point. And so I think it's a difficult move. It's a difficult walk. There's no doubt about it. But I think that, and I feel this way in all of life, I think we're stronger together than we are separate. And I think we better understand one another, and we better understand one another's needs if we're together than not. So I think that, and in some cases, so for example, again, harkening back to my own situation here in Arizona, we have a large number of Native American tribes and reservations, the Navajo being the largest. There are those on the Navajo reservation who don't even speak English. And there is not a word in Navajo for cancer, I was told. So it's difficult in some cases to move into that community. But if we can't work together, then we still continue to struggle. And so maybe this is a Pollyanna view, I just prefer to think of it as the more we can talk about it, the more we ask others to join us, regardless of what the us is and regardless who they are, the better off we'll be in being able to understand one another's challenges and difficulties, and what faces those minority and disenfranchised groups as they move forward in their own survivorship. And I do address that in a chapter of the book, not only African Americans, but Native Americans, Hispanics, the LGBTQ community. I learned things as a white girl, I never would have guessed. And it breaks my heart, and I wish I had wiser words to say.
You know, for many years, along with their assemblies, they ran town halls, and including independent of their assemblies. We had actually NCCS sponsored coordinated town hall when we had our first NCI biennial cancer survivorship conference in DC. They helped put together our town hall that preceded that. And I keep wondering whether we need to bring something like that back, that takes it into the community, wherever you are, wherever you're having your meeting, and saying, let's start this with the voices from the community and hear about the sort of testimony, if you would, about what's happening and what's important to these different communities. Because I worry sometimes that what we're creating and developing is not relevant out in a broader context. And one way to find out, A, is it relevant, but B, what needs to be examined would then be something we heard about. And I
think that's a brilliant idea. think that's brilliant. In fact, there was one story, I used the NCCS newsletters a great deal too for background information. And there was a story in one of the newsletters from that very first town hall where a woman was speaking about the financial burden, which we now call the financial toxicity of cancer. And she started her little question, I guess it was, or statement by saying, this was a Saturday, by saying, on Monday, I'm going to declare bankruptcy because my hospital bills are so large. I don't want to destroy my family. It's easier if I think she said it's just easier if I declare personal bankruptcy and divorce my husband and go off and get my things taken care of and then come back. And there was a palpable inhaling because so many had never even considered that. And this was in the 90s. So there was health insurance, but it wasn't a universal thing by any means. And there was still a great deal. I mean, there are still things now that aren't accepted, but there was still it was quite a hurdle to get a lot of treatments accepted and covered by insurance. So I think something like that could very well happen with regard to these communities as well.
Yeah, I think the financing of this is a huge issue. Advocates in research, Judy. So Betsy's asking, what do you think is the role of advocates in research? So you're talking to a bunch of researchers here. A lot of us, this is our bread and butter. What's the message to us?
So I'm asked often what more needs to be done in the survivorship movement. And so this is sort of along the same lines as that as well. And I always begin by saying it's sort of like when someone says, well, the government should do this or the government should do that. And of course, we are the government. So we need to take it upon ourselves to make sure that our voices are heard through our senators and congresspeople and all of that. So the same thing is true in the survivorship movement. We are the survivorship movement. And it's not just those of us who have been diagnosed, but all the groups we've talked about, the healthcare providers, the co-survivors and family members, and certainly the researchers. And I think, again, I spoke about one of my goals for this book. Another one of the goals was that those groups, all the non-survivor groups, would also read this book and understand a little bit about that history. Because let's face it, you're cancer researchers, you'd be researching something else if it wasn't for cancer. So you ought to know more about maybe part of the cancer continuum, which is survivorship. I think it's also good for researchers to see the benefits of what you've done. We are the fruits of your labors, whether it's you're researching psychosocial issues or whether you're researching actual treatment possibilities. The successes, survivorship is the success of oncology and the success of all research that's done. I think that we are doing a better job of, and now I'm not we, that sounds like the imperial we, I think the medical community is doing a better job of listening to patients, which is important, and of being open to understanding what we're asking or telling the medical community. This is not right, something's wrong with me, I can't describe it, but I just know this is not me. And I think that's a really important step as well. And lastly, advocacy takes on many forms. Ellen and Betsy wrote a wonderful article about the different forms of advocacy. And first of all, as a patient of anything, is self-advocacy. You have to be able to ask those questions and tell your healthcare providers you don't mind, if you don't, that a difficult answer is coming. You're going to know anyway, sooner or later, might as well know at the outset. Secondly is advocacy for others. It's so important having someone else with you, if possible, taking notes, of the questions or the questions you ask or the information that's being given. And then lastly, advocacy on a grander stage, be that local government, state government, or national government. And that, I think, is where researchers can really step in, because you are the ones with the alphabets behind your names. You certainly have a much different view of the cancer world than we do, or potentially whatever group it is you're speaking to does. So you all can be fabulous advocates in your world. You're important. Let Congress know, let patients know, get involved in other organizations. I know your time is so limited, but in non-professional organizations, so that you can share what you're doing. That's really important to those of us who come from the other side of the bed, I guess, as it were.
Judy, is there something I haven't asked you that you were hoping I was going to launch at you?
No, I don't think so. Other than I really just want to tell everyone that I love doing these with this group. I've now reached 500 people that I've been able to do these virtual events with, and they're free, they're easy to set up, and I just want to keep the conversation rolling. I'm not trying to sell books, although that'd be great, but most important is just to get this history into the hands of everyone who needs to hear it. So please email me, let me know if you're interested in doing it for your university, your organization, survivors at your hospital, whatever group you got, I'm your girl.
What a wonderful, careful that, Judy, it's a wonderful offer. We may have you signed up for the rest of your life. Forget your next book. You're going to be too busy to do it. I think we can't underestimate. I'm always struck by the importance of advocacy. Certainly, the Office of Cancer Survivorship wouldn't exist. NCCS wouldn't exist. A lot of the work that we do, we would have no advocates for the resources to do it. We would have no participants in our studies if people weren't willing to give of themselves to help others have a different experience, have a different outcome. I always felt, aside from being a huge privilege of being in the Office of Cancer Survivorship, that it was actually the heart and soul of the Institute. Very vain, I know. That there's a lot of this other research going on, but this is about people. This is what your work is all focused on, whether you work in a lab buried down somewhere with isotopes or little genes and molecules or mice. It all ends up being for people. Right. And we focused on what does that mean for the person. And I think the coalition and that history of that intrepid group of 23 individuals, and I'm sorry I didn't bring the picture. I do have the picture of the founders that I would have plastered up here, and some of them very recognizable to you, people like Harold Benjamin, who had founded the Wellness Community, and that we now know of the Cancer Support Community. Michael Lerner, again, sort of fits up right up front, who wrote so brilliantly about it. Another book, if you're going to have a short book of reading, is Vital Signs. It was probably one of the first personal accounts I read when I got into the field. It's his experience of self-diagnosing his cancer, actually, as a young physician, and then what happened to him as a consequence of that. Very beautifully written, beautiful writer.
The important thing that I always share with non-survivors is the notion that cancer doesn't end when treatment does. It's always a part of your life in one way or another, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be a bad part of your life. My organization's fundraiser is an annual storytelling event, big surprise there. And every year, it's a cast of 8 women, different women every year. Every year, at least half of them say, cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because, and then they go on to explain why. But it is always going to be a part of our lives. And that's why the survivorship movement and survivorship research is so important. It really is.
Again, I'm so grateful to you, Judy, for taking on this enormous task and giving us the gift of that history so that we all know where we come from and why we're doing the work that we're doing. I open the floor if anybody has a last question they want to ask Judy.
And I just want to remind people, I know we're all heading out on summer vacations, so it's a great read, and I've learned a lot through the process. So I encourage you if you haven't had the chance.
Spoiler alert, the last chapter is a tough one because a lot of our heroes make their exit. And I think we have, in this past 4 years, lost some of those really potent leaders who were, who we've been in the shadow of, whose work we are following. One phrase that Ellen Stovall always had was, there's Race for the Cure, very sexy Race for the Cure. It's wonderful. We can get a lot of money for that. But what happened to Race for the Care? What about Race for the Care? Because it, even if you cure somebody, there's going to be a lot of caring involved in that. And I jokingly, so maybe the reason I got the office at the NCI is when I had my interview with Richard Klausner, then NCI director. I don't know quite how that came about in the conversation, but I looked him squarely and I said, Dr. Klausner, if you cure cancer tomorrow, my office will still be needed.
That's right. That's right.
Anyway. Thank you, Judy, and thank you for everybody for joining us this evening and for all the work that you do to make a difference in the lives of survivors and the voices of survivors that are so important for us to hear and to get feedback from and know that what we're doing is right and making a difference. And yes, we have a lot of work still to do. So
thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to CPCRN. We appreciate your fielding this.
Thank you very much.
Stay cool, everyone, please.
Bye.